Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion on the American Muslim poll. My name is Dalia Mogahed, and I am the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Today, we're going to present some of our research specifically on Islamophobia from our report, which you can access online for free, American Muslim Poll 2020, Amid Pandemic and Protest. After I present the research, we're going to be joined by a panel of phenomenal thought leaders to discuss the results. You can join the conversation by tagging us on social media. The hashtag we're using is ISPU poll. So what I'll do today is cover why this poll, why was it so important to do this poll this year? And then I'll go through our methodology and then just dive right into the key findings, and then we'll do our panel discussion. So before going any further, I'd like to just thank the sponsor for this webinar series. So this is a series of 4 webinars. The first one was last week. This is the second one. We have 2 more to really unpack the results of this poll. Amana Mutual Fund is the co-sponsor for our webinar series. And we have a link to their information in our chat box. So why this poll? We knew right away when we were planning this poll that our 2020 Muslim poll would be historic. So first of all, it's our 5th annual poll, so we finally have a trend and can see how things are changing year to year. But it's also the year that we have a critical election. And we launched this poll on October 1st and are discussing it just weeks before this historic election. But there were 2 other things that happened that we didn't anticipate that made this research so important. One is we fielded this poll, this survey, right as the lockdown for the coronavirus was beginning in mid-March to mid-April. So what we were able to do is capture the mood of the nation right at that historic moment. We also did this research just months before another historical phenomena, which were national and even global protests calling for racial equality in our country and all over the world. So our partners, as they have been for the past 5 years, was SSRS, and they were the polling firm that conducted this research on our behalf. So we created the questionnaire, and they actually conducted the interviews and selected the panelists, or selected the respondents. SSRS does the polling for CNN, CBS, ABC, The Washington Post, and many other media outlets. They're really one of the premier polling firms in the nation. The sampling and weighting of our data was led by Jonathan Best, the Vice President for Advanced Scientific Methods at SSRS, who is a longtime member and presenter at APOR, and a member of the American Statistical Association. So just some details about the poll before we dive into the results. All participants in our polls, as always, were given identical surveys. We include in this research a nationally representative sample of Muslims, and the sample size was 800, Jewish Americans at nearly 400, Catholic Protestant, and then within the Protestant community, white evangelicals, as well as non-affiliated Americans. The survey field period was March 17th to April 22nd, and you can read a much fuller description of the methodology on our website at ispu.org/poll. We also had the brain power and advice of some phenomenal advisors, all leading thought leaders in the field of Muslim studies, as well as specifically quantitative research on Muslims. So to jump into our findings, this is the section of the research that looks at Islamophobia. The two key takeaways from this section is that, one, over the past 3 years, while the general public has remained pretty constant in their level of Islamophobia, Jewish endorsement of anti-Muslim tropes has declined. So Islamophobia among the Jewish community specifically has consistently gone down year after year over the past 3 years. And then for the general public, political ideology and party affiliation predicts Islamophobia, while religiosity does not. Now, other topics that were covered by our poll that you can keep an eye out for were things like divorce in the Muslim community and in other faith, non-faith communities, mental health and suicidality, religious literacy, media consumption and the impact of media, experience and views of addiction, and disability. So the Islamophobia Index. So first, the anatomy of the Islamophobia Index. How do we measure Islamophobia? When I say Islamophobia, what do I mean? What we did is to create an index to measure public perceptions of Muslims, specifically how much people endorse 5 key anti-Muslim tropes. And these are the following. Most Muslims in the United States are more prone to violence than others, discriminate against women, are hostile to the United States, are less civilized than other people, are partially responsible for acts of violence carried out by other Muslims. Now, these 5 key tropes were chosen very, very deliberately. Why these questions? The 5 variables are based on previous research linking these perceptions with greater public tolerance for anti-Muslim policies, such as mosque surveillance, racial profiling, greater scrutiny of Muslims at airports, the so-called Muslim ban, and even taking away the rights of Muslims to vote. So we chose these because they are linked to policies. And that's really the important piece that I want you to remember here, is that Islamophobia is both an interpersonal phenomena as well as an institutional phenomena. And what's important about these questions is it kind of creates that link, because these perceptions, when held in the public, make bad policies much more enable bad policies to be enforced. So we actually found in our research that Islamophobia is bad for democracy and security. So we found that a higher score, a higher Islamophobia index score, is linked to greater acceptance of violence, greater acceptance of militaries targeting civilians, greater acceptance of individuals targeting civilians, greater acceptance of authoritarianism. And what's really ironic in many of these cases is how higher Islamophobia is linked with perceptions that Muslims are accused of that are actually Islamophobic tropes. It's also linked to greater support for discriminatory policies targeting Muslims, so the Muslim ban and surveillance of mosques. But Islamophobia doesn't just hurt Muslims, it hurts other communities. So Islamophobia opens the door to other kinds of bigotry. In another study that Gallup conducted in 2010, the variable most strongly linked to self-reported prejudice toward Muslims is self-reported prejudice toward Jews. Respondents who say they feel a great deal of prejudice toward Jews were 32 times more likely to also report prejudice toward Muslims. So it's a very strong link between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. We also found some other things that predict Islamophobia, or in this case, we looked at what predicts lower Islamophobia. So here are strong predictors of lower Islamophobia. Being a Democrat. So partisanship is a huge predictor of Islamophobia. Identifying as a Republican is a strong predictor of Islamophobia, whereas being a Democrat is a predictor of lower Islamophobia. Favorable views of Black Americans is a predictor of lower Islamophobia. Favorable views of Muslims, that's kind of obvious, but here it is. Favorable views of Jews, the LGBTQ community, and then knowing something about Islam as a faith. These were the strong predictors. Moderate predictors were favorable views of feminists, knowing a Muslim, and high income. And then weaker predictors were identifying as liberal, unfavorable views of evangelicals, and then having a Muslim friend. Factors that were not predictive of Islamophobia: nativity, meaning if you're an immigrant or if you were born here, whether you're a man or woman, your age, your education, and then most importantly, your religiosity. Being religious, whatever faith you are, did not matter to whether or not you had you endorsed anti-Muslim tropes. Really, to summarize, fear erodes freedom. According to not only survey research, but even neuroscience research, fear makes us more accepting of authoritarianism, conformity, and prejudice. And that's exactly what we found in our survey research. So with all that said, what does the Islamophobia Index look like now in 2020? So the way we sort of compile this is we take the percentage of people in each group that endorse anti-Muslim tropes, and we regulate it, or we standardize it to a 0 to 100 scale. So a 16 is not 16%, it's 0 to 100, it's on a scale of 0 to 100. So this year in 2020, the Islamophobia Index score for the Jewish community was 16. For Muslims, it was 20. So yes, some Muslims do endorse anti-Muslim tropes. 16 and 20 are statistically comparable, so it's not that Muslims are higher, but they are actually on par with Jewish Americans as well as non-affiliated Americans. The general public this year was 27, consistent with previous years. Catholics and Protestants, 29 and 30, and then white evangelicals, as we've seen every single year, are always the highest of any group, and they are at 34. So Jews were less likely to endorse anti-Muslim stereotypes since 2018. So here are the scores for the general public in 2018, 24, 27 this year, pretty consistent across the board. But American Jewish opinion has consistently improved, or that the percentage of endorsement of anti-Muslim tropes has consistently declined over the past 3 years. And when you look at, each specific question and what is happening, you find first the percentage. These are now percentages. The percentage of American Jews who endorse, with a strongly agree to the idea that Muslims are more prone to violence, went from 15% in 2018 to only 8% in 2020. Muslims discriminate against women. This one stayed pretty consistent, and interestingly, the idea of discriminating against women is the most salient idea or stereotype in the public and among really every group except for Muslims themselves. So 23% of Jewish Americans endorsed this stereotype in 2018, and it went down to 19% in 2020. That one actually has not changed. But what did change is hostile to the US. It went from 13% to 6%. And then the last two are less civilized than other people, 6% to 6%, that has always been low. But then this one I think is quite important, are partially responsible for violence committed by other Muslims, went from 16 to 6%. And this is an important decline because especially this trope, this idea of collective blame is strongly linked to endorsing or accepting anti-Muslim policies like surveillance of mosques, like singling out Muslims for extra scrutiny at airports, etc. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our panel. Just a second while I switch windows here. Great. Dr. Kayla Wheeler is an assistant professor of gender and diversity studies at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. She's an expert in contemporary Black Islam in the United States. Dr. Wheeler is writing a book on the history of Black Muslim fashion in the United States. The book is based on 5 years of research, including interviewing Black Muslim fashion designers and attending fashion shows in Atlanta, Philadelphia, and Newark. Dr. Wheeler is also the creator of the Black Islam Syllabus, a free resource guide that highlights the experiences of Muslims of African descent. She has a PhD in religious studies from the University of Iowa and a master's in history, Islam in the West, from Queen Mary University of London, and another master's in bioethics from Case Western Reserve University. Just in case you did not feel inadequate today, then this resume will probably do the trick. We also are, and I'll also add one more really important piece about Dr. Kayla, and that is that she is an ISPU expert. Dr. Rabbi Nancy is an associate professor, Emeritus of Religious Studies, and the founding director of the Department of Multifaith Studies and Initiatives at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. A 1982 graduate of RRC, she holds a master's degree from Yale Divinity School and a doctorate from Temple University in Religion. With support from the Henry Luce Foundation, Kreimer has pioneered innovative community-based learning opportunities for rabbinical students from across the denominations and their peers of other faiths. Her projects include dialogue retreats for emerging Muslim and Jewish leaders, cultivating character, a conversation across communities, and campus chaplaincy for a multi-faith world. So thank you so much for being with us today, both of you. Kayla, I'm going to start with you. We have consistently found a link between anti-Black racism and Islamophobia. So as you might remember from my presentation, we found that one of the protective factors against Islamophobia is positive views of African Americans. Another way to put it is anti-Black racism is linked very strongly to Islamophobia. Please talk to us a little bit about these two types of bigotries, how they're related, but also how they might be distinct.
Yes, so I think it's first important to keep in mind that Black people make up a very large percentage of the American Muslim community. Anywhere between 25% to 1/3 of all Muslims in the United States are Black, even though they might be of different ethnicities. So African American, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latinx, and then from the more directly from the continent of Africa. And if you look at the history of Islam in the United States, the very first Muslims who came to the US were enslaved African Muslims. Primarily from Senegal and Gambia, Western and Central Africa. So Islam in the United States has always been positioned as the other, and Muslims have always been oppressed. So most enslaved Black Muslims were restricted from practicing their religion out in the open, and that's one of the reasons why Islam among enslaved Africans did not survive in its entirety. You can see cultural elements of it in the Gullah Geechee community, so in the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia and the Carolinas, and all the way down the southeast coastline. But most of the religion was lost because enslaved African Muslims were not allowed to practice it. Moving towards the 1900s and 2000s, we know that many of the Islamophobic practices initiated by the government were first tried out on Black Muslims. So going back to J. Edgar Hoover with Raycon, it was a program to surveil organizations that were deemed un-American and to have un-American ideologies. J. Edgar Hoover particularly took interest in the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Temple of America because of their public advocacy for Black Muslims and Black people in general, and particularly the Nation of Islam, because they took, in their early years, a very isolationist approach. The nation wanted to form a nation within the United States that was fully self-sufficient from Black people. And many members of the Nation of Islam refused to fight during World War II, even if they were drafted. So many of the early leaders of the nation, including the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, ended up being arrested, convicted, and imprisoned for failing to register for the draft or to report for duty once they were drafted. And you can continue on going on with COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program that ran from the 1950s to the late 70s that targeted political organizations. But if you look back at the FBI files, really did center organizations that were committed to liberation and social justice. So marginalized groups, including the Black Panther Party and the members of the Civil Rights Movement, but again, the Nation of Islam, because they advocated for self-defense. And so Malcolm X ended up surveilled. Many members of the Nation of Islam were imprisoned and arrested. And one really central piece of COINTELPRO was disinformation campaigns, using the media to get the public to turn against Black Muslims. And you see that coming up with media today, where so few Black Muslims are represented. And when they are, it's not being real Muslims practicing Islam that's on the margins. And even today with programs like CVE and its new iterations under the Trump administration, Muslims in particular are still surveilled, but Black Muslims, particularly Somali Muslims in Minnesota and Massachusetts, are disproportionately affected. So when you talk about Islam and Islamophobia in the United States, you really do have to center Black Muslims and recognize that everything we are seeing now goes all the way back to the transatlantic slave trade. And I think one of the big differences between Islamophobia and anti-Blackness is recognizing that not all Black people are Muslim, number one, and not all Muslims are Black. And within the two communities, there is oppression. So within Muslim communities, there is a significant amount of anti-Blackness amongst non-Black Muslims. And that usually shows up in claims of authenticity and authority. So claiming that Black Muslims are not real Muslims, assuming that they are more committed to the politics of Islam than the theology. And in many Black communities, you face Islamophobia with relatives or non-Black Muslims, assuming that Christianity is the only way to go. So there are moments of collaboration, but there still are moments of tension between the two groups.
Thank you so much, Kayla. And absolutely, to your first point about the two groups are, of course, not mutually exclusive. You're absolutely correct, of course. And the American Muslim community is the most ethnically and racially diverse faith community in America, and the plurality of American Muslims are Black or African American. Now I'm going to turn to you, Rabbi Nancy. I mentioned that the only group for which the Islamophobia index has declined year after year has been among the Jewish community. Can you comment on that? Did that surprise you? And what do you think accounts for that decline?
So first of all, it did not surprise me at all, because I've been involved in this work since just after 9/11. I've seen this happen in my own experience. I've talked in hundreds of Jewish groups, and I have seen the decline. And I would like to personally take credit for all of it, but I don't think I can do that. So what I've learned is that in the last 15 years, I started doing this work with Jews because I realized that I was totally unprepared in my years of learning about Jewish-Christian dialogue to know anything about Muslims in America and how to interact effectively. So I started to learn. I got a steep learning curve. And what I found out was Jews were curious, ignorant, compassionate, frightened, eager, outraged by religious intolerance and injustice, really not sure about Muslims, and did I mention ignorant? So I had to explain a lot of things to Jews, even as quickly as I learned them. For example, most Jews I met back in the day, in, let's say 206, I would say, they would say, oh, this person is Black and a Muslim. They must be a Black Muslim. They're a member of the Nation of Islam. And I had to explain, no. Most people, they are Black and they are Muslim, but they are not Black Muslims. They are not members of the Nation of Islam. A small percentage of Black Muslims actually are members of that sect, that organization with Farrakhan. So why did the change happen? So one of my theories, which apparently is not correct according to your study, is that Jews actually got to know real live Muslims. That was my experience working for many years now with the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. My experience was that women who met other women, Jewish women getting to be in a group with Muslim women, found themselves connected with a woman who had the same sort of issues they had, and there was an instant bond, and it only took one good friend to shift things around. But according to your survey, that is not the major force, so I'll say a few other things. I think the rise of anti-Semitism from some of the same sources as Islamophobia, something else that you mentioned, Dalia, that the 2010 Gallup poll showing that these two hates go together, they travel in tandem, is something that we Jews have noticed, and it certainly has increased our awareness of and concern for Islam and for Muslims. I think the Muslim ban at the beginning of Trump's administration had a big effect because Jews really resonate to the issue of immigration, and that's one where Jews are just right there. Banning people from this country because of their religious origin does not sit well with Jews. Jews, also, I think the race thing has an issue. I think Jews in 2006, when I first began working on this, thought of themselves as a racially monolithic group. They were mostly white, and Muslims in America were this racially diverse group, which made us very different. But we now know that that was never true and is even less and less true every day, that more and more we're learning that, and I know this because I teach African-American Muslim, African-American Jewish students in rabbinical school, that Jews are not just white, and that when we talk about Black Lives Matter, now we're not just talking about other people, we're talking about our community as well, and that's been a bond. But I will say that I think the largest issue has to do with the biggest obstacle that Jews faced, which was that they were Democrats, they were liberal, they had all the reasons to be on the good side of that ledger, but the obstacle was Israel-Palestine. And I think that as we go through the years, and the last 3 or 4 for sure, Israel-Palestine has shifted in the American Jewish community. It's a demographic thing. If you look at younger Jews, are much less engaged with the conflict altogether than older Jews. And when they are engaged, they're much more likely to be pro-Palestinian than their elders. The disaffection of Jews from the Netanyahu government, I think, has a huge impact on bonding Jews and Muslims. And finally, my last point has to do with Donald Trump, who never promised to bring the country together, and he definitely has not. He's divided the country in horrible ways. But I will say that in my experience as a far to the left Jew, I have found that he brought my people together because he has brought everyone in the Jewish community from the center on left together by shining a spotlight on just how ugly and problematic some of those things are from a Jewish values perspective, Islamophobia included. So those are my reasons, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. What occurs to me, and I think many people have made this case, is that Islamophobia is really a branch on a larger tree of white supremacy, whether it's anti-Black racism or anti-Semitism. It does have a common origin. I'm going to now turn to some of the questions we're getting from our participants. The first one here is, last week we also encountered Muslims having negative views about Muslims. What does this mean for us as a community, particularly now that Jews are more favorable of Muslims or have more favorable views of Muslims than Muslims do? So thank you for your question. First, they're not more favorable, they're on par, so they're the same. And I'll start by answering this question, but I'd really love to hear from our two panelists as well. We have looked at internalized Islamophobia among Muslims quite extensively in our work, and I'd encourage you to look at our 2018 and 2019 research reports where we delve into this a bit more. Especially the trope that is especially pronounced among Muslims is the one about being more prone to violence. And there's another question here, which is interesting. Why has Muslims that degree with more anti-Muslim policy significantly increased in recent years? Could this mean that they know something about their own culture's violence that others don't know? No, that is not what is happening. Let me explain. First, the facts in terms of FBI reports and law enforcement statistics are that Muslims are not more prone to violence. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Also, research on public opinion shows that Muslims are some of the most condemning of violence in terms of just their views of what is acceptable morally. Muslims are the least likely group to think that targeting civilians is okay. So it's not that this is the reality, but this is what people are consuming in media. So one study that we did found that Muslim defendants facing terrorism charges received 770% more media coverage. And these are people who are facing charges of plotting, not of actually executing an operation. They'll receive 770% more media coverage than white supremacists who are also defendants in a case that is identical to what the Muslim perceived defendant is facing. So there's this constant media hyper-focus connecting Muslims and violence. Muslims are going to tune in and resonate with that information more than anyone else. So when there's a news story about that, Muslims are hearing that and paying way more attention than anyone else. We also found that Muslims were the most likely faith community, followed by Jews, but Muslims even higher, to say that when they hear about a member of their faith community doing something bad, they feel personally ashamed. Up to 40% of Muslims are ashamed of something they've never even had anything to do with. But there's a sort of socialization and priming of Muslims to actually internalize collective blame. And so if you're paying more attention to these news stories, it is going to be how you perceive your own community, even if it's not reality, right? Interestingly, acts of violence are, when they do exist, are very, very tiny, minutia percentage of people who are involved in something like that, but they're done secretly, and they're folks that are always outside the community. So it's not like people know about things that, other people don't know, but since we don't have direct contact or knowledge of these things, we are learning about these things from the same toxic media as everybody else. And it's going to form how people view themselves because they're so tuned into those stories, and very similar phenomena occurs among other minority groups, actually. So I just wanted to answer that piece about internalized Islamophobia, but I'd love to hear from our other panelists as well, if you'd like to add to that.
Well,
go ahead.
I just want to say I perked up when I saw that, and I sort of smiled to myself because internalized anti-Semitism is a very old story in the Jewish community, and it's just such a reality. I felt it this morning. I opened up the New York Times, and the front page has to do with Hasidic Jews who are not complying with COVID-19 restrictions, and oh boy, did I feel it. I was so attentive to it, just like you said. I was attentive to it because it was about Jews. It was negative. I was like really getting clearly internalized anti-Semitic feelings about those, clannish Jews. Sorry, it's a thing. Be curious to hear what Kayla has to say.
Yeah, I think that's also an example of anti-Blackness, because a lot of times when Muslims themselves are talking about other Muslims, they're usually referencing Black Muslims. And even Rabbi Nancy, when you were talking about clarifying that most Black people are not Black Muslims, a part of the Nation of Islam, even making that distinction itself is a form of Islamophobia, because it's making claims about authenticity and authority, and is kind of positioning the Nation of Islam as not real Muslims, it's not real Islam. And ignoring some of the theological developments within the nation.
I'm sorry, maybe you misunderstood. I wasn't trying to did you think I was somehow saying that they were not actual Muslims?
No, but I'm saying that's how it's usually when people say Black Muslims. I know you weren't doing that.
No, I was just giving them factual information about the percentage of Blacks who were actually involved in that movement, because they're very scared of that movement because it's known to be anti-Semitic. That's what they're scared about.
Yes, and so it's talking about when you say Nation of Islam, like even who do you mean? So there's a long history of the nation and who even gets to claim ownership of that word, because the founder and leaders of the Nation of Islam, his son is actually a Sunni Muslim, and it represents one of the biggest Black Muslim communities.
Right, but
yeah.
I just want to make sure I wasn't misunderstood. I was just trying to give them information.
So a question for Kayla. I'm wondering if Dr. Kayla can speak on the experience of Black Muslims in the US before 9/11. I know she touches on the Nation of Islam and Black Muslims being imprisoned for refusing to serve. How has the Black Muslim identity in the US changed since 9/11?
I think it's really interesting. I don't know if so much the identity has changed, but how people relate to Black Muslims is very different. So pre 9/11, I think even pre the first Gulf War, Black Muslims were kind of seen as the boogeymen. They were the evil, like scary ones. You don't really know what they're thinking. They're violent. But then as soon as 9/11 happens, Islam is no longer seen as being a domestic threat. It's a foreign threat. So you see non-Black Arab Muslims being racialized as racial others, and them being positioned as the true threats to American security. So on the flip side, Black Muslims become good Muslims. So you see a reclamation and an appropriation of especially Black Muslim men who in the 60s and 70s had been demonized. So Malcolm X, who was at one time like public enemy #1, he now has a stamp. Muhammad Ali, who had his heavyweight title stripped, and his funeral was publicized. It was probably one of the first Muslim funerals that was put on live TV. And he's friends with all of these conservative politicians who in the 60s and 70s, I'm sure would have hated him. And you're seeing the same thing happen with media, with Dave Chappelle, Black Muslims being an example of good homegrown Muslims. But that's limited to Black Muslims who were born in the United States and have particular politics and religious beliefs. It doesn't always extend to African immigrants, especially Somalis and East Africans. So it's a very, very narrow view of good Black Muslims.
Okay. So this question comes from Caleb. He's asking, you discussed how different religious beliefs affect the Islamophobia index. Is there also a correlation with what region of the country people are from and their Islamophobia index? So unfortunately, at least from our perspective, we have not been able to do a regional analysis because of just sample size. But I'd love to hear from our panelists, starting with you, Kayla, perhaps on your experience with any regional differences that you've encountered when it comes to perceptions of Muslims.
Yeah, so I think the more diverse area of the country, I wouldn't say it's a north-south thing, but I would talk about whether it's an urban environment. I think you have different perceptions about what a Muslim looks like. So when we think about big hubs for Islam, of course, New York City, Chicago, but LA and Atlanta. So just different understandings of what Islam would look like. I think probably the most interesting geographic area is the Midwest. When we think about Islam, we usually think of it as a coast thing, a big thing, but American Islam really kind of got its start in the Heartland region. So of course you have Chicago and Detroit,
Right.
but Iowa, Cedar Rapids actually has the longest standing mosque in the United States. And so I think in parts of the Midwest, it's much more Arab centric. But a diverse understanding of Arab. So in Iowa City, where I did grad school, there's a huge Sudanese community there. So complicating what we understand Islam to look like, as well as what we understand Arabness to look like. So I would look at immigration patterns and migration patterns and talk about how that influences more than actual like a north-south divide.
It's really interesting. We did find that knowing a Muslim is a moderate predictor, a moderate protective factor against Islamophobia. And having a close friend is also a protective factor, but even stronger than both of those is knowing about Islam as a faith. So it was interesting for us that level of education did not matter, but level of education or knowledge, self-reported knowledge about Islam was actually the only really strong factor when it came to knowing something, knowing a person or knowing about the faith. So I wonder if that also correlates with regions, where is religious literacy or things taught about Islam more likely to happen.
So I want to answer that because it doesn't fit my experience. And I know you did the study and there's statistics, but my experience is that people can have all kinds of graduate level courses on Islam, and they still don't understand what it means to be a Muslim, and that meeting someone, I have seen, for me, in my experience, the geographic thing is almost not relevant at all. I've talked to Jews all over the country. What seems to be most relevant for me is age. I think older Jews simply did not go to college with Muslims. They do not know Muslims. They had, if they're physicians, they have Muslim colleagues at the hospital, but they don't talk about religion because people of their age who are Muslim, who are doctors, didn't in the past and institute those conversations. And younger people who have gone to college since people are aware of these issues and engage in these conversations have a whole different understanding because they're part of a world of multicultural and intersectional identities and people who are, the children of intermarriages and Muslim Jewish connections. And I see such a radical difference of age that the other things pale. But when I started to do this work, I used to bring around Muslim grad students that I had a grant, I would pay them, Penn University Muslim grad students who I'd bring around to Jewish nursing homes, and I would do a whole slideshow about Islam and all the fallacies that they believed. I would ask them questions, what's true? And they would, they would all think all the fallacies were true and then show them they weren't. And then I would introduce them to Adnan Zulfikar, who was, studying at Penn and was getting a PhD in Islamic studies and law degree. And he would charmingly talk to them for 20 minutes and they were a whole different thing. They were like, oh, so you mean Muslims are just people like Adnan, It's like, and it was so remarkable to me. So that's just been my experience. And the other thing is that the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom has 170 chapters around the country and in Canada, including 11 for young women in high school. And my experience on the board of that since the day it was founded is that being part of one of those chapters is transformative for the Jewish women in terms of their understanding of Islam, as a protector against Islamophobia.
You know, it's really interesting you say that, Rabbi Nancy. I think, of course, I'm not disputing the power of a relationship. I'm just wondering if it's maybe a combination of the two, because I've also seen people have close Muslim friends, even Muslims in their families, and still harbor incredibly Islamophobic views because they cast that Muslim as the exception, as the one good Muslim in the world.
That's fair. That's fair. I think it's a combo. It's a combo. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it doesn't take one, but it's certainly when you're in a group. I'm in two groups. I'm in the Daughters of Abraham, which is Jewish, Christian, Muslim book group for women. And I'm also in Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. And I've seen those groups be transformative for people. But you're right, it may be a combination of knowledge and relationships.
Yes, yes. So there is a question here. Does knowing a Muslim lead to less support for Islamophobic policy? My experience in a small town in Tennessee is that people think you are an exceptional Muslim. Yeah, this
Right.
idea of exceptional.
I think you're right. I think, Dalia, that you're right. It could easily be discounted. And the same thing with Jews, you know, oh, well, one of my best friends is Jewish is one of the tropes that we have, which is that, you know one Jew and you like them, but you're still anti-Semitic in terms of your, yeah, I hear that. I hear that. That's.
Mm-hmm. There is a question here from an anonymous attendee who feels that the language that we're using to describe Latino people or Latino people is one that she's objecting to. She feels discriminated against with the use of the word Latinx. So she is bringing that to our attention and has asked twice about it, which is why I'm bringing it up to honor her concern. Does anyone want to comment on that? Or
I respect your views. So I'm not Latina. I'm following the lead of queer and trans friends that I have and community members that I have, including Muslims who have asked me to add the X. I think that's one of the limits of colonial languages is we're not nearly as creative as our ancestors are. And there's only so much that we can do as colonized subjects. So I recognize your feelings and I respect them and I appreciate you for sharing. Thank you so much for it.
Thank you. So another question that has just popped up is, I haven't read the report, it's okay. But is there a gender dynamic when it comes to Islamophobia? So I can answer that. We found that gender is not a factor actually at all. Women and men, all else being equal, being a woman, simply being a woman, all else being equal does not protect you. It's not a protective factor against Islamophobia. And I mean, that's certainly been my experience. I've had the most Islamophobic interactions almost always with women. So it's certainly that the stereotype of women being more tolerant or whatever has not been the case with my life experience, and certainly not in the data either. So no gender differences. We've found many differences among Americans, according to different other factors, but gender is not one of them. And I encourage you to look at our previous reports where we go into a lot more detail on that. Age, interestingly, also is not a factor, all else being equal. So just simply being a young person, if everything else is the same, does not protect you against Islam, is not a protective factor against Islamophobia. Neither is education level, as I mentioned. So a lot of these things that we kind of, the conventional wisdom that all these things are protective factors, they actually are not. And so we do have to do a lot more deliberate unlearning of the pervasive Islamophobia that we're all consuming every single day, including Muslims.
So I just want to say my experience is different on the age. I see a great difference in age, and I think it's also related to views on Israel, because remember, being a Democrat is a protective factor. and 75% of
Mhm.
American Jews are Democrats. But we have a thing in our community known as liberal except for Israel. Which is that
Right.
they take all the views of the Democratic Party, except that then when they come to Israel, they flip over to a more right-wing position that's more pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian. And that has been shown over and over and over again to be directly related to age. Older people have it, younger people less. And so I don't know, but in my experience, that seems to also correlate with the kind of fear. When I had students, older students who would take courses with me about Islam, and they would just constantly be talking about, when I was in Israel once, somebody blew something up in the coffee shop right next to me and they were Muslim, and they've had like real traumatic, it's all like in there, and I just don't hear that from young people. Not anymore.
Yeah, and absolutely don't. I don't even think what I said necessarily contradicts that at all. I just mean all else being equal, it's not a factor. So
right. No, it might be a factor for a small percentage of the whole population. So for the whole population,
sure.
Age may not be a factor, but in this small subsection of the community, which is only like 2% of Americans, I am telling you that my experience and studies have shown that age does predict, which is a good thing if we're interested.
Yeah, it's hopeful, of course. Yep, it is very hopeful. Yeah, and when I think we've all seen studies that show that young whites were as likely as older whites to vote, to favor Donald Trump as president. So there's a lot of complexity in that.
That's probably true of the general population. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So a bit off topic. Well, that's okay. We can do that. Why do we use the term Islamophobia when a phobia is a disorder? Yes, this is a question we do hear quite often. It insinuates that those with the phobia can't help themselves. There's a difference between phobia and anti-Islam, anti-Muslim. I'm genuinely interested in why that's the term that's being used by the mainstream. So I can't speak for the mainstream. I will speak for us as ISPU, why we chose to use Islamophobia and Islamophobia index. And there are three main reasons. One, because the field has been established, and the word is, the word that the academic field has chosen, which we are just entering into, is the word Islamophobia. So we want to strengthen that field and add to it rather than to undermine it by coming up with a new term. Islamophobia would not be the term that I would personally come up with if I was coming up with it today, but it has become an understood phrase, very similar to anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism, you break it down linguistically, is not accurate in that there are other Semites besides Jews. Most Jews aren't even Semites, right? So it's not, but we all know what it means. And so Islamophobia is very similar. It's that it's not perfect, but we do know that it is a type of bigotry. Similar to homophobia, I think we all understand that it's a type of bigotry. It's not a disorder. So while you're absolutely right, linguistically, there are lots of problematic reasons. We are choosing to use it because it's the term that has been established by the academic study of this phenomena. Second reason that I would say, why I don't call it anti-Muslim bigotry, although I use those terms interchangeably, we did choose to go with Islamophobia, is because it is, rather than a description, it is like a word, a label for it. And I think naming things is very important versus just describing them. And then the third reason is because the word Islamophobia is universally detested by Islamophobes. I don't exactly know why, but that is a good reason to use it, in my opinion.
That's very funny.
Kayla, or would you like to comment on the term? What other term do you use, or if you think it's a problem to use it?
So I try to use anti-Muslim sentiment or anti-Muslim racism. I think Islamophobia is easier to communicate what you're getting into, but I think what especially anti-Muslim racism and anti-Muslim sentiment allows you to do is to talk about all of the other people who are affected by Islamophobia. So usually we center Muslims with Islamophobia, and that makes sense. But there are also people who are read as Muslim, racialized. So especially Sikh men, if they wear turbans and beards. Some of the first victims of anti-Muslim sentiment after 9/11 were Sikh. We know the shooting in Wisconsin, the white supremacists thought that they were Muslims. So I think there's no perfect way to describe it. It just depends on your audience. And I think if you want to talk to a broader public, Islamophobia is a lot neater for people to know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. So thank you. I've been on a 40-year campaign to get people to stop calling Jew hatred anti-Semitism for all the reasons Dalia said, and also because Semitism and anti-Semitism were invented by an anti-Semite. The word was invented by an anti-Semite in Germany, and it means it's a ridiculous word. It doesn't deserve a hyphen or a capital S. It deserves if anything, it's a one word, and just for the reasons Dalia said, it's recognized, so we use it, but I would put it in quotes for all the reasons you said. It's a terrible word and we use it. So in the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, we don't use Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. We talk about anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim sentiment, hate, prejudice, whatever, is the appropriate next word. Absolutely.
So there's a question here specifically for you, Dr. Nancy. Person is just asking, I'm wondering what type of Jew you are and how that affects your views on political policy.
Okay, so I'm a Reconstructionist Jew, which means that I'm on the left progressive side of the Jewish spectrum, both in terms of belief and practice. And that does affect, the Reconstructionist movement probably will have about 1 or 2% of our members will vote Republican. So, just saying, that's the world that I'm in. And yet I will say that I don't live just in that world. And as I said before, when I got interested in Islam and in American Muslims, I went out to all kinds of organizations. I spoke to Orthodox Jews. I spoke to many, many different kinds of Jews. And I get around. But does that answer your question?
So finally, just one last question here. How can young, okay, they said yes, thank you, so we're good. A lot of anonymous attendees. So how can young Muslim researchers get involved in studying Islamophobia? What opportunities exist for us? So I'll just speak on behalf of ISPU. We're always looking for interns. So please, send us an email at info@ispu.org and tell us about your interest and your capacity, and we'll see if we can connect you to a project. Okay. And I'll just turn it back to our panelists for any closing remarks, and then we will close out our webinar today. Thank you. Kayla, you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, I would just say thank you all so much for attending and your questions. I think if there's one takeaway, is to recognize how interconnected all of the liberation struggles are. So if you want to talk about Black liberation, you have to talk about Jewish liberation, and not just because there are Black Jewish people, but because we are all oppressed by white supremacy and Christian normativity, and Muslims as well. So seeing how these movements are connected and have always been connected. So what we're seeing now with Black Lives Matter movement and other movements, they're drawing from a long legacy of interfaith and interracial collaboration.
I agree with everything that Dr. Kayla said. And I would add that, again, within the Jewish community, we have benefited from this country so much. We were late to the game, America was during World War II, but eventually let in immigrants. But before 1924, it was my relatives benefited from being in this country. And I feel a kind of, as many Jews do, a real debt both to this country's values and its aspirations, and to Muslim people today who, you know, are in a situation that it seems so clear to me, and it's still kind of amazing to me that that any Jew would not get it, that that we all benefit from having a pluralistic society that lives up to its vision of openness and religious tolerance, and more than tolerance, religious encounter for the benefit of all of us.
Thank you both so much for being with us, and to all the participants who joined today. I think this conversation is incredibly important, and we will continue to monitor this this topic. It's something we study year to year. So we hope to see a continuous decline in these kinds of endorsements of anti-Muslim tropes and bigotry against all people. Thank you very much. And this is the conclusion of our webinar.